What I want to talk about is the question of trust in news media, and this is early stages of what will be an ARC discovery project that will be undertaken with Sora Park and Caroline Fisher from the University of Canberra and with Uwe Dulek from here at Best. And we pick up on the general context of this crisis of trust that some of you may know of UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres' statement in 2019 that the world is suffering from a bad case of trust deficit disorder. People are losing faith in political establishments, polarisation is on the rise, and populism is on the march. And it has a number of communicative manifestations to it, that there's the rise of what's been referred to as illiberal democracy, so as sort of, if you like, democratically elected quasi-dictatorships, of which Russia, Hungary and Poland may be examples. Fake news, which of course I'll say a lot more about, and the related concept of post-truth communication. It also has led to the resurgence of conspiracy theories, and of course the onset of COVID-19 has been ample ground for conspiracy theories, and its wider context is a crisis of trust in mainstream news media. Now, some of you can pick out your favourite example of fake news. The one on your left is from the 2016 US presidential election. On the right, this is a game that has been created by psychologists at Cambridge University, which allows you to produce fake news. And you accrue badges for your capacity to draw upon techniques of fake news, including discrediting, conspiracy, trolling, polarisation, impersonation, for instance, Twitter accounts that resemble those of famous people, and the ability to tap into emotions. The latter is particularly important in emphasising the degree to which fake news is not an easy problem to address, because often underpinning the measures to address fake news, there's a certain set of assumptions around why we seek to consume news that I want to consider in this presentation. But the wider context is this question of distrust of mainstream media, and the Edelman Trust Barometer has measured this over a 20-year period, that media and government are considerably less trusted internationally than business and NGOs. And you can also see there, this is the Gallup surveys of trust in the US from 1973 to the present, and you can see that among the sharpest declines there are those in newspapers and television news. So you see from the green there a general decline in trust, but we see newspapers, 27% decline in trust from 1979 to this was 2019, and television news from 54% to 23%. Okay, and this from the most recent Edelman Trust Barometer, you can see there again a decline in trust in traditional media over the period from 2019 to 2021. But importantly, because I think this discussion around distrust of the mainstream news media has been around for about as long as I've taught media studies, and that's a while, I'm afraid to say. But once upon a time we might have said, yes, but what about citizen journalism? What about the platforms? What about Twitter? We can see there digital platforms are generally less trusted as news sources than mainstream news media, and trust in digital platforms is declining. So I think whatever the sources of the crisis of mainstream news media have been, digital platforms have not proven to be the panacea. Now, there's some peculiarities in considering news and trust which make it a different topic in many respects to, say, considering trust in financial institutions or trust in government departments. Firstly, citizens should certainly not always trust journalists or news media. I recall a presentation from an Egyptian scholar talking about during the period when Hosni Mubarak was leader, where hundreds of thousands of people had protested in the streets of Cairo, but equally importantly, hundreds of thousands of people were also stuck in traffic because of the protests. So the cumulative number of people affected by the protests was heading into the millions, yet there was absolutely no mention of the protests on Egyptian state television. So in this and many other instances, the scepticism of citizens towards the news they receive is well warranted. Secondly, not all news is informational or non-partisan. I note here this is the homepage of The Guardian when the Comment is Free page was first launched online in 2006, and the statement comment is free comes from C.P. Scott, the founder of the Manchester Guardian, and the second part of it was, but facts are sacred. So this distinction between fact and comment is an interesting one. It's become a particularly important one in the era of the internet because among the many consequences of news on the internet, informational content has now been completely commoditised. You can get factual information from anywhere. If you want to know about the Prime Minister's speech to the National Press Club yesterday, you can go to his homepage and download it. You don't need news sources to provide you with that. So what people are seeking from news sources is something different to pure information. And in this respect, partisan news certainly has appeal. And finally, news media and journalists as the fourth estate are expected to be mistrustful of others. And the Washington Post in 2017, February 2017, no coincidence in terms of the date, redesigned its masthead with the phrase, "Democracy dies in darkness." So it explicitly stated the mission of the Washington Post as being one of revealing uses of power that were contrary to democratic purpose. Taking a consumer perspective on news in broad terms, and the economists Olcott and Genskow talk about this in their 2017 paper on fake news, that broadly speaking, there are two things that people seek from news. Firstly, they seek informational content, and informational content, as we know, is vitally important for liberal democracy, social cohesion, economic well-being. We can draw a long list of factors on why information is important to functioning societies. But also, consumers derive psychological benefits from the news they consume, and this is related to their decisions to consume news as distinct from the range of other media or indeed other activities that they could be undertaking. And these can include affirmation, confirmation, reinforcement, and so on. So there's a psychology of news consumption which makes it difficult to simply eliminate fake news by taking out stuff that is not factual. Because the balance between the informational and the psychological will shape the extent to which news providers prioritise trust. And this relates to issues around balance and bias, questions of partisanship. So if you think about the UK media, for instance, there's a long history of partisan newspapers, the point being that most readers understand the party political bias of their paper in question. So if you read The Telegraph, for instance, you know it has an alignment to the Conservative Party. If you read The Guardian, you know it has an alignment to the Labor Party. And also the preferences of advertisers, investors and subscribers inform not only what news is covered, but the ways in which it's reported. So that is to say there's a variety of value relationships in news, and Robert Picard explored this, that news creates different kinds of value for different stakeholders, be they the investors in news businesses, advertisers, audiences, journalists and society at large. So to provide a broad sweep, if we think about something like the Watergate scandal and the Washington Post reporting on the Watergate scandal, this is at the high point of the primary value in news being captured by the publishers and the journalists, okay? And that created the surplus that enabled large-scale investigative reporting of that sort. One of the consequences of the development of the internet was that it shifted the value equation to increasingly benefit advertisers and consumers, but reduced the surpluses available to news companies. Digital platforms impact on trust questions in a variety of ways, yet there's a series of paradoxes here that social media networks draw upon apparently high trust in interpersonal networks, yet we consistently find that news on social media is subject to more questioning than that from branded news sources. Digital platforms recirculate rather than produce news, yet news has different degrees of trust depending upon where and how it was sourced. Algorithms are designed to match news to our already revealed preferences, yet we worry that this puts us in echo chambers, filter bubbles and so forth. And it also remains unclear from the many studies undertaken whether the greater degree of trust in news is connected to greater preparedness to pay for news. News is, as Uwe Dulek has pointed out, a credence good, not only an experience good in that its value is not known prior to consumption, but also its quality or value is often not known after consumption. Hence this question that we have around the value of news that we've received. And there's obvious asymmetries in all of this between the producers and consumers of news that historically have been dealt with within news institutions, gatekeepers, professional ideologies, value news brands, etc. That's under challenge, but the media system remains a hybrid one. So to pick up on Andreas's talk this morning, that the Twitter pylon that you described towards Gigi Foster would only make sense if it originally came from the ABC Q&A. Social media remains largely dependent upon traditional media in terms of the content around which conversation circulates. And so we have this hybrid media system, but we certainly don't have the disappearance of branded news or what's referred to as legacy media. I'll very quickly note a few findings from a study undertaken by Ozan, Uwe, myself and the Canberra researchers on trust in news brands. It reveals the highest levels of trust were towards the news brands you'd expect, the ABC and SBS, Financial Review, the Australian Television, reasonable news brand, news trust, newer news outlets, lower levels of trust. Factors that promote trust or mistrust, you can see there. Lack of transparency, advocacy, sensationalism were seen as factors. Interestingly, a neutral standpoint is seen as a factor promoting trust, but as we observed, often people will seek out news that conforms to already existing beliefs. And so these were some of the suggestions around how to increase trust in news. So some of the conclusions we came to there: Australians are not more distrustful of news than the global average. Established news brands have the highest degree of trust. Greater engagement on social media on the part of journalists and publications will not in itself build greater trust. I think that's been an important finding of recent times. Australian news consumers are seeking greater accountability and transparency about news content, but they're also seeking greater accountability and transparency about a lot of public institutions. So I think we shouldn't be exceptionalist in our reading of news here. Brands remain a very significant variable in behaviour based around trust in news content. And the final finding, which won't have time to explain, but we found a very large portion of mistrusters of news. This is not, I mistrust news outlet A, but I trust news outlet B. This is mistrust of news in general. And that group tend to mistrust other societal institutions and possibly constitute about a quarter of the Australian population. And they're a very hard group to win back for information from any source. And why this matters beyond, say, the future of newspapers or television stations and so on, is that we currently have a mass vaccination rollout about to happen, and a very important variable on that is the extent to which people are prepared to take vaccines, and a very important variable on that is the extent to which they trust government and health authorities. So news trust issues loop back into other societal questions around trust.